a pleasure having you on our channel today, Ambassador. How are you doing these days? Are you able to work from home? Are you staying isolated?
Thank you, Camila. Good morning. We are following, which is very important, all the indications by the Canadian authorities, both federal and provincial, which is key to address this challenge. Therefore, most of the staff is working from home. We have a very little personnel rotating at the embassy. Myself, I'm here, but we are keeping as much as distance as possible, taking, again, all precautions, but most of the staff working from home thanks to these technologies that allows us, by the way, to do that.
Of course, no, this has definitely been a big change for a lot of people, but for the better. For Mexican Canadians, what is the latest update or the latest news that's coming out of Mexico regarding this pandemic?
Precisely just this morning, the government announced that we are entering to the called second phase, where the government is calling for stricter measures, closing schools, for example, asking people to maintain social distance, washing hands, of course, limiting the possibility for people to gather above certain numbers, but also people on their own are taking their own precautions. So you can see now that cities are less busy, many places are closed. So we are entering again in this phase. And second, the government also announced a larger, or explained rather, a larger health sanitary program, how our institutions, health institutions, hospitals, the Army, the Navy, are going to work together to make sure that people have proper health attention.
And if there are Mexicans here in Canada, is it still possible for them to return home with all of these new rules being implemented?
Yes, and in fact, we've been encouraging Mexicans that are here or have been here in Canada for, let's say, temporary periods for either tourism or any other, to if they agree to go as soon as they can back to Mexico. There are still flights. Airlines are still operating on a fairly regular basis. Connection people from Canada, Canadian in Mexico are also coming back. So the possibility is there. It's very important that they do so, because in few weeks or few days, airlines will eventually stop flying, or the number of available flights will be very, very small, and therefore going back to Mexico would be harder. And also Mexicans here that are in Canada on, as I said, temporary basis, may face all sort of difficulties, including budget difficulties. So we've been communicating, encouraging as much as they can, as I said, to all of them, to, if they don't need to remain in Canada, to go back to Mexico. That is the safest thing to do now.
So that's being recommended even to students or temporary workers. Like, let's say they went back home to visit their families for March break. Do they stay in Mexico now?
In those cases, it depends, because many people that could have been in Mexico right now might find difficult to return, depending their immigration categories. Because now in Canada, only Canadians and permanent residents can enter this country, and that this has been already for the last few days. In the case of workers, particularly seasonal workers, we are very much in close contact with the federal authorities to make sure that there is absolute clarity on what would it be their situation, who would it be responsible, or who is responsible, salaries, if they have to be subjected to certain isolation, for example. So far, we have no cases reported. But if that is the case, who would be in charge? Of course, our consulates are very much on top of that. Same for students. The students, we are talking to universities to understand what are their policies. We understand, we hear that in some cases, at least, universities are being very generous and very helpful to students, offering different kinds of support, including the ability to stay in the dormitories, et cetera, et cetera. But still, we need to be clear on that. And again, if someone doesn't need to really remain in Canada, if home is in Mexico, we really encourage them to go back, because we don't know how long this will take.
Of course. And now we've all seen, of course, a lot of news. There's still been a couple large gatherings in Mexico, and there's still a lot of social events. Do you think at any point these gatherings have to stop?
The government is already, this morning's announcement is precisely in that sense. Today, it was formally introduced, or what is called the second phase entered in effect, and therefore new rules are applying. So you will see a dramatic, I think, reduction of all those gatherings. And as I was saying, people themselves are increasingly aware of the challenge of the situation, and they are staying on their own at home. Kids are no longer going to school, or are no longer going to school. You see shops, etc., closing down.
Of course. And lastly, what message do you have for our viewers, and of course for the Mexican Canadian community back home that is watching this?
Follow the advice from the government. Either if you are in Mexico, follow the indications from or by the given by the Mexican government. If you are in Canada, follow the indications given by the Canadian government. These indications, in both cases, are based on very technical sanitary criteria. They respond precisely to the situation currently, so they have to be followed. So my message, my call to all Mexicans here or Canadians there is follow the indications.
Perfect. Well, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us this morning and for all of these important answers.
Thank you so much, Camila. Pleasure. Good morning.